Now let's dive right into it. I mentioned it, the history of robot journalism is a fairly recent one. In March 2014, after an earthquake in California, a so-called QuakeBot produced the first text message for the LA Times just 3 minutes later, and that is considered sort of the birth minute of automated journalism. Yet even in pre-digital times, of course, journalism was never static. And in order to understand how AI is changing journalism today, and in line with the philosophy of the Cologne Futures, we thought it's helpful to look into how journalism and the journalistic system has reacted to leaps in communication technology in the past. And this is what we want to begin with. Here to enlighten us on the connection between media evolution and journalism and the journalistic system is Martin Conboy, Professor Emeritus for Journalism History at the University of Sheffield, where he started teaching in 2005. In his work, he has focused on historical aspects of journalism, national identity and the media, popular journalism, and critical approaches to the language of journalism. He has published a number of books on these subjects, notably The Press and Popular Culture, with one or two more books. Martin, you're going to enlighten us on this in the works at the moment. He's a regular contributor to national media in the UK. And I just only recently found out that his German is indeed better than my English, because he spent years living in Potsdam. What a pity. We're conferring in English today. You have to endure with my English. So without further ado, I'd say, what are you thinking, Martin? The floor is yours. We have to see a presentation. Do you want us to run it?
Yes, please.
Okay, let's see.
If I just do old technology and say next slide when I want the next slide, and then a real finger can press on the button.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Please. Go ahead.
Can we see the slides?
Oh, is it not working? Sorry, apologies.
No. Oh, perfect. Yeah. Thank you very much, Leonard, and everybody involved in the organization for inviting me. It's quite strange to be talking in this sort of forum, but I'll do my best with pieces of paper stuck around at various parts of my desk with my notes in lieu of a lectern. So the title here, which I find really very interesting, very engaging, is Journalism as a Product and Factor of Media Evolution. So I'd like to move on to the next slide. And to cite somebody who I suppose retrospectively we could call some kind of journalist, Jonathan Swift, had a modest proposal. My modest proposal is to propose that history is to be used as a resistance to a teleology of communication. And I think history is vital in order to avoid amnesia, to distinguish the radically novel from more routine shifts over time. And I think that the political implications of this distinction is a fundamental one, as I will argue. Next slide, please. I think that we have here three key words: the product, factor, and evolution. I think journalism is certainly a product of media developments. I think it's certainly a factor within media developments. Whether it's an evolution or not, or something else, I think that's a very interesting question, and one that I'd like to address as I move through the slides towards my conclusion. Next slide, please. We need news as a necessary precursor of journalism. We have editors before we have journalists. We have correspondents before we have journalists. We have distributors before we have journalism. And we have audiences for news long before we have anything formally recognized or etymologically recognized as journalism. And I think it's worth noting that journalism, according to my research, is a word that enters Western European languages, normally from French, so at some point debatable in the early 19th century. This is, of course, a long time after we had the formal printed circulation of news, at least. So news as a necessary precursor of journalism. Elite news flows across distances were fine for those with the money and resource to afford them, the wealthy, the powerful. Others had to do with local news or news from travelers, always eagerly awaited. But roads needed to be improved before improvements in the technologies of communication could prosper. Next slide, please. Here we have a print from 1590. If those of you who can read German can read that German, well, congratulations. And here we have three key references here from the horsebound distributor of news in the 16th century. Key to his trade with common people were that he was transacting this spread of news for money. Second key element is that it is fresh, it is speedy as the horse and the roads will allow. And probably most important, die Wahrheit. He's claiming that these sheets that he is distributing have true news. And I think that's one of these key elements that we look at when we're moving towards our definitions. So this was an example of news being distributed before journalism had been formalized, and news being distributed to the common people, if you like. Next slide, please. Before Jeff Bezos, we had the richest man in the world, Jakob Fugger, a key instrumental player in the foundation of news networks to facilitate his businesses and his investments around Western Europe and beyond at the cusp of the 15th and 16th centuries. These bundles of newsletters, these news books, pre-printing, coinciding with the rise of printing for other forms of communication, were an absolutely central part of elite communication. And whereas the rider with his news might have lost customers if his news was not timely or accurate, those traveling with the news for Jakob Fugger and other elite aristocrats, kings, queens of Europe, might have lost more, like their head, if their news had been improperly inaccurate. Next slide, please. News is printing, looking at technology here as a feature of change, not a driver of change. Journalism is, as I've said, a relatively late arrival in the communication ecology, and it has changed and is changing. And printing, as we all know, does not see the arrival of printed news. It matches other political, religious, cultural priorities. And in fact, we might say that the other political, social, and religious and economic issues in the 15th century surrounding the development of printing, they overdetermine the reception of printing in that century. So it's hardly surprising, next slide please, that the print rooms of the 15th and 16th centuries are predominantly occupied with Bibles, politically and religiously very, very interesting and important, the reproduction of material in vernacular languages and literature. It's a reasonably long time into the development of printed technology for us to start to see a coherent push by printers into this area, which we would now recognize as news or journalism. Next slide, please. News is driven by human curiosity. And we could divide this into the news that you need and the news that you want. And in making that rather crude distinction, we could further create two categories there of the social and the civic. And I think that those are very resonant terms for the contemporary, but the social and the civic were also very resonant terms at the start of this process of human curiosity becoming encapsulated within print technology. Next slide, yes, thank you. One back, double-headed pig. Can we go back one slide? Here's an early experiment in news that you probably don't need, but news that a lot of people wanted, demonstrated by the fact that you have here the three languages, looking simultaneously at three markets, the news of a double-headed pig. I am pretty sure that a double-headed pig would get on the front page of the Bild Zeitung today. It would certainly get on the front page of our tabloids. And I think this is a good example of a social aspect of the news. Next slide, please. This particular news publication from the English Civil War is from a royalist supporter, John Crouch, and it is his Mercurius Fumiogus, the Smoking Nocturnal, and it contains, as you can see here, dark and hidden news. This is the literal dark side of journalism, and it is a journalism of scandal, of scatological detail on the misdemeanors of the parliamentarians, presented as part satire, part news. So it's sort of blurring that distinction between the social and the civic, the gossip and the political, in a very striking fashion. And journalism over this period, as it starts to emerge in print, as news starts to be circulated on a regular basis in print, you see that it becomes refined into a regular patterned experience for particular audiences. And moving slightly ahead, we might argue that today it's the particularities of those audiences which are being shattered in the contemporary world. Next slide, please. If we were walking past the newsstand with that headline, I'd buy that. Or maybe I wouldn't buy it. Maybe I'd try and just rifle through the pages a little bit to see how much I could read. Why I Had to Kill Diana, given more resonance now at the moment with the popular series on television, The Crown, and the re-emerging scandal about Martin Bashir's interview with Diana way back when. Again, this is news that we probably don't need, but do we want it? Well, the Globe and other supermarket tabloids in the United States have feasted on this sort of material for a long time. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Very crudely, journalism could be defined as news and comment, just as interesting and important, about the world directed towards a specific audience. And I argue in those previous three slides that it's fundamentally dual. It has information and it has entertainment. And I think one of the problems with the concentration on the political aspect of civic journalism is it sometimes creates a neglect of the equally important entertainment factor of journalism, notwithstanding the fact that some people find the information entertaining and vice versa. Next slide, please. So journalism has always developed in negotiation with its practitioners, its audiences, and technology. So clearly what I'm arguing here is that we're not seeing technology leading anything. We're seeing technology and audiences and practitioners in a complex set of relationships and negotiations. And I think over history, I'll try and give you some examples in the next slides, we can see that. Next slide, please. Two fine German gentlemen, Koenig and Bauer, develop their industrial steam printing press, but interestingly, it's developed in England, initially not in Germany, because the industrial and investment opportunities were there for them to develop their already well-developed plans in a particular economic and industrial setup. Of course, once they'd launched their printing press with the Times, they then moved back to Germany, and the rest, as Miss Piggy would say, is history. E.P. Thompson has an interesting take on this moment in the industrialization of the press, round about the time when we start to see journalism being defined within communication ecologies. E.P. Thompson, the radical historian, claims it's at this point, once really serious, large amounts of money are needed for the industrial steam presses, it's at that point where the radical press gets quickly edged out of the picture. Next slide, please. Here we have the fine machine and the Times behind it. Until this point, the printing presses that were used would have been recognizable to the likes of Caxton, to the likes of Gutenberg. Developments of the technologies from the 15th century, but this was a totally different beast. The industrialization of print meant that no longer could you compete seriously with this sort of technology, with the economies of scale, with the economies of distribution. And of course, what is very well documented now from this point onwards is that the elements of the radical press, particularly in England, start to be incorporated within a more broadly popular press, becoming the Sunday press, becoming eventually very rapidly through the century the tabloid press. So the popular becomes commercialized. It's also interesting that John Walter started in 1785 a newspaper called the Daily Universal Register, soon to be changed to the Times in its title, as an experiment. John Walter was a printer, and he thought that his new printing device, the logographic printing press, which printed which used whole words, the logos, rather than the individual letters to make up pages, could be a financial winner. He was wrong. So the logographic printing press was a failure, but I think we could all agree that the Times was rather a successful newspaper. So it's an illustration of how a technology can be experimented with, brought in with one purpose, can generate a quite different outcome. And behind all of that, John Walter's profit motive was the driving factor. Next slide, please. Once we're into the heart of the 19th century, you see the mass popular growing at the same time as advertising. And initially, as we know from Michael Schudson's work on the popular penny press in the United States in the 1830s and 40s, you see the civic value of the small ads, the civic value of advertising for services, for jobs, recruitment, for commodities. And later in the century, particularly in the French press, Le Petit Journal, you see the growth of large plate advertising at the same time as you have much better quality paper that can hold much better illustrations, particularly of fashions. and you see the rise of the great department stores like Les Galeries Lafayette, etc. So you see this industrial modernist phase is not just about the journalism. It's not just about the high modern ideals of democratic involvement. It's got the advertising that will drive the revenue that allows those more democratic ideals to be reached for. Next slide, please. And we see what Standage called the Victorian internet, the development of the telegraph, which is the real shift in acceleration, compared to which our accelerations these days are relatively unremarkable. It's the telegraph that really speeds things up. And yet, despite the fact that many historians have accepted the easy narrative that it's the telegraph that leads to a telegraphese style of language, the inverted pyramid, etc. Substantial research on a textual basis by Hoyer and Pöttger has shown that actually it takes the best part of 50 or 60 years for the alleged impact of the telegraph on the language of journalism to start to filter into the regular use of these traditions in the newsrooms. And one of the reasons they posit is the culture, the resistance within the profession of journalism to the implications of telegraphese, until the newsrooms are ready and journalists are ready and willing to take this on board. Next slide, please. Various technologies into the 20th century show this lag, this resistance to media developments. Radio is initially considered as a threat to journalism, a threat to newspapers, and it's also, particularly in the British setup, radio is dealt with as an oral version of a newspaper, where newsreaders were simply allowed to read out text that had been prepared as news agency material for newspapers. Television, famously in Britain, once again, television in the post-war years was introduced as a voice over a picture of Big Ben. So it was television being produced as if it was radio. And again, it was seen as a threat both to the commercial markets of newspapers, but also to the high standing of the voice of radio, as if the visual would be a distraction to the quality of the journalism. And online, I read recently a notable commentator on recent developments. It might have been Klaus Nielsen, Rasmus, who said, it's too soon to know what the digital era will be. We are certainly not living in it. There are too many lags from legacy media, which are continuing to determine our definitions. We're simply seeing the emergence of a technology. What if online is as slow to be incorporated really within legacy journalism practices as the telegraph was back in the 19th century? Next slide, please. Early computerization in the 1980s led to more pages and less journalists. It led to a diminution of specialisms. It led to journalists being asked to work twice as hard to cover those pages. It did not lead to a flowering of alternative media as prices were driven down. It actually led to an increased amount of consolidation within media ownership. And as an illustration of that, next slide, please, we have a famous beneficiary of the changes of the 1980s. He's not complaining. Next slide, please. So dangers of amnesia, I think one key danger is that we lose the human intervention. We lose the incrementality of the techno-media interactions. And we also, most importantly, to return to the point I made at the start of the political implications, which insist on the place of history in these discussions, is unless we have history in our vision, then we lose sight of the invidious role of giant corporations within the playing out of, let's call it, a liberal communications environment. Next slide, please. So journalism is both a factor and a product, but I would argue that it's within a cyclical, not an evolutionary process. And that cyclical process, which has been described by Asa Briggs and Burke as a zigzag, could better be refined as adding that this zigzag is spiraling. And you will forgive me if I don't have a slide of that, because a spiraling zigzag is a difficult thing to draw on a PowerPoint. So history indicates that journalism is shaped within technological developments at the same time as these developments are adapted to the constraints and aspirations of producers and audiences. History may not demonstrate continuities over time in this respect, but at least it provides contexts for the ruptures of the present and warns what is lost if we lose this perspective. Final slide. McLuhan writes of media technology developments emerging within the rear view mirror. I quite like this image. These traditions emerge with all of the baggage that they have gathered around them from the past. But good drivers need to look in the rearview mirror and keep their eyes on the road. But at the same time, we could, to extend that metaphor, say that the backseat occupants within this journalistic extended metaphor seem to have taken over the wheel. So we need to keep an eye on the road, an eye in the rearview mirror, and we keep on talking to those in the back seats. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Martin, for this fascinating talk, which I really think provides a wonderful basis for the discussions that will be coming, and where we will obviously look even further in the future and discuss the present in greater detail. But as I said, it's really the very core of the Cologne Futures philosophy that history matters and the historiographical perspective matters. And I found it incredibly fascinating, particularly your insights and comments on the interrelationship, or how on how audiences, practitioners, and organizations are intertwined, and how journalistic cultures I should say, I guess, evolve out of that, and what this means in the context or against the backdrop of a time where we're talking algorithmic cultures is something that I'm very excited to be discussing. But and there are many other things that I actually took note of, but I don't want to monopolize my position here. And I really want to invite you now, all the panelists, but also our listeners, really from all over the world, more or less, at least from many countries, to chime in and ask questions or comment on what we just heard. I know that Lutz Hachmeister next to me definitely has a few comments, and perhaps we start with him. But please just raise your virtual hand, and I elevate you to speaker status for your question, or you may write your questions in the Q&A. Here on Zoom. Lutz, please.
Okay, before I'm forgetting it, I'm taking over. You mentioned it at the end of your very enlightening lecture. Of course, Marshall McLuhan, with who I think is still the alpha and the omega of media theory after all those decades. And just to focus on another observation of McLuhan, he famously said that every new media configuration, or every new medium turns an old one into an artifact, into a piece of art. And could we, when we extend that to journalism, which has, of course, many economic, technological, cultural factors, couldn't we say journalism as a term and as a profession is so much linked to this older media environment that it gets an artifact? I think we all agree that there will be many pieces of fine journalism in the future, and as a function, beginning with the antique news system, it will survive. But one has the feeling, and I myself worked as a journalist and a media researcher, that it is linked to older mass media in form of a profession. So we don't know about its future, but we do know about its glamorous past, or we think we know something about its glamorous past. So we always link this kind of journalism with glamour and power and Bob Woodward, and I hope he's still alive, and Carl Bernstein, to the last century or to the 19th century. Is it a completely false impression, Martin?
I mean, could I concentrate on the first part of your question about McLuhan and defunct media forms becoming art forms? And I think what we're actually seeing at the moment is a sort of very, very contemporary variant of that, which is the growth in really niche publications that one reads. And I'm thinking in British terms of the London Review of Books. I'm thinking of the New Statesman, and I know in Germany you have very, very successful old style print books, which people consume, not only people of our generation, but people who want to buy into that process, that tactile process of consuming news in that concentrated sort of way. It's almost like a distillation in the second part of your commentary there, a distillation of some of those idealizations of the person sitting there in the coffee shop, in the public house with a physical artifact. So I think that the circulation figures for those sorts of very high quality, very specialized publications indicates that there is an almost art form engagement with certain sorts of non-speed, non-instantaneous, non-shareable news information these days.
I can add that Bodo Hombach, once famous German media manager, he ran the once famous WAZ, Westdeutsche Allgemeine Zeitung. He compared it to the Swiss luxury watches, the revival of the analog Swiss luxury watches, which are very expensive, which are very much sought after. And journalism in its peak, elite journalism, will turn to something like that, like the Swiss analog watchmaking industry. One last remark from me. There's this famous article, Darwin Among the Machines. There was a book by George Dyson. George Dyson we had as a guest here at the Cologne Future. This article is from 1863 by Samuel Butler. And as we know, in the first time, someone envisioned that the machines would take over in a Darwinistic way over mankind and the craftsmanship of mankind. Would you call it too futuristic to think about a similar model for journalism?
Pass. that's
Darwin among journalism.
that's way beyond even my imaginative powers. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much. Are there other comments or questions from our panelists or those listening to us? Invisible for the time being, but again, I can elevate you to speaker status. I sort of stumbled on you quoting Mr. Rasmus Klein-Nielsen, is it right, from Oxford, whom you referred to with this quote, whether he wasn't sure whether we live in the digital era yet or not, because there'd be too many legacy media organizations that hadn't actually arrived there. I mean, but doesn't that, I mean, related to what Lutz and you just discussed earlier, is that valid? I mean, or isn't that just a symptom or a consequence of us clinging on to traditional notions and concepts of journalism, when in fact, I mean, as others have argued, the digital era is of course pervasive and long there. It's just a matter of who participates and who doesn't participate, both with regard to sort of institutional actors and legacy institutions, also in the political arena, and in the media arena, and with regard to people consuming media. So it's not an either or question whether it's there or not, but it's a matter of who participates, who doesn't, who's benefiting from it, who's left behind, and what the actual consequences for our established notions of the public sphere, democratic public sphere, that is sustained by the concepts. The concept of journalism that we hold dear, but that might not be there in the future. Just because we've been taking it for granted in the Western world for a few decades doesn't mean it'll exist.
Yeah, I agree, but I think what that statement intends is that the implications of the adoption of new media technologies, the exploitation of the web, etc., are so multiple and so powerful that at the moment they are still in negotiation with legacy lags, with traditions. For instance, the whole definition of journalism, which, as I said, I mean, the word comes to us in the early 19th century. So it's by far it's a very, very recent, in historical terms, development. And when we look at the ways that we look back at the public sphere, this idealized early 18th century moment in coffee shops, when we look at the ways in which the British press is held up as watchdog, the famous Fourth Estate, these are terms that go back to the 18th century and the early 19th century. And we're still living with those terms as definitional parameters of what journalism is measuring itself against when it comes to online. And I suppose when you mentioned the idea of participation, I think in my recent reading of participatory processes, what we tend to see is that just like early computerization in the 1980s, we're not actually seeing the sort of flowering of an empowered, revitalized online public sphere, because the resource isn't there. The resource for the citizen, whoever that person is, to go out and access those people in power with knowledge, the time, the expertise, to actually set up these alternative fora, they're not there, because those fora continue and are increasingly dominated by very powerful global media players. I mentioned Jeff Bezos, in joking while showing up the Jakob Fugger print. The idea that the Washington Post becomes the plaything of the guy who is like the richest man on the planet, allegedly. You think, yep, new participatory public sphere. You can participate in that if you've got, I don't know how many billions. Yeah. So I think all of those key terms, how they play out, and the political context in which they play out, go far beyond the technologies. It's about what the intentionality behind the adoption of those technologies tell us about the political context in which we're living.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I mean, these are certainly issues that we're going to be looking into in greater detail also in the following sessions, particularly at 4 or 3 p.m. your time, and then the session on the algorithmic public sphere, democracy down the rabbit hole, and later on with Cory Doctorow, we'll be talking about the political economy of the platform era and what it means for democratic journalism and what we can actually do about it, what the political implications are. Very fascinating. I know Lutz, Lutz has another comment. Yes, please.
Short remark. Yeah. What I found fascinating is your reference to this research. When does the Telegraph really has an impact on the journalistic style or the self recognition of journalism? And it as you said, it lasted obviously much longer than we think. We think as soon as the telegraph was invented, then journalistic style changes. And that's a good question towards the internet, as we call it, or the online sphere. The question is whether the online sphere had any aesthetic influence on journalism at all yet. Or is it just a distribution medium? Is there any significant impact of like television or film or radio or printing had an impact on journalism and public communication? What is the real aesthetic or structural impact beyond mere transformation or acceleration of the online sphere on journalism? That's an interesting evolutionary question.
I think one of the things that's been observed is that when you're looking at the algorithms that generate the top reads, and you get the fabled dancing cats, etc.
Yeah. I like them.
I like dancing cats.
I'm a cat video lover.
And it's interesting. What it does, obviously, is it means that people who are producing news need to be very mindful of including details that will get those stories elevated. And I'm just as a casual observer of what gets into the most read on the Guardian and the BBC's pages, they're not characteristically elite news stories. I'll tell you one very interesting one that got up there on the BBC yesterday, and it was a policeman who's just been sacked because he scanned the barcode on his carrots twice instead of scanning the carrots once and his packet of Krispy Kreme cakes once. And the Krispy Kreme cakes were £9.95. The carrots were 9p. And it was alleged, and he was found guilty of deliberate deception, and he lost his job. And I think talking about news that you want and news that you need, that is not news that I needed, but it's very interesting, and you can understand why that went up the algorithmic charts to say, this was a story people found interesting.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, I think the content, when you start then to think of the amplifying effect of Facebook and Instagram, etc., and Twitter, I think all of those factors mean that those, what we would have called in the past sort of like tabloid features, are permeating more and more into the mainstream elite news media.
Okay, that's a shift in reception, which leads to a shift in production. But in my perspective, it doesn't change much the style or the aesthetics of journalism. It's mere a problem of quantity and quality, or reception and.
But what would be an aesthetic change that you'd be thinking of?
Yeah, for instance, how the Telegraph changed the let's say a simple way, the Hemingway style, or something like the Dispatch style. It might be, maybe I'm overlooking something, and we are overlooking something right now. But I think rather than in the distribution context, or some new media forms like Twitter or Facebook, the online sphere hasn't done much. Hasn't given much new to journalism. So perhaps we tend to it's a huge economic question and a question of revenue models, and that's clear. But what's the impact on the journalistic?
It'd be interesting to hear about Wiebke and Jerome and so on. And Thomas, I have to say, I guess we're on the verge of a time where, I mean, if we talked about this 10 years down the road, and with augmented reality and virtual reality and how that and the impact that has on journalism at a product, when we're sitting in our cars, maybe 20 years down the road, I don't know, but it's already being worked on, and you sit in the car and on your window shield, journalism is being distributed and automatically so, and personalized, and you get personalized content, not just a personalized news stream, but really personalized article, if that ever happens. I don't know, our experts will tell us. That might be a more profound aesthetic shift. Are there other questions or comments from our panelists or speakers? I don't see any hand raised. I'd be wondering, Martin, maybe that there's an apt question for final remarks before we move on to Wiebke for the moment. But do you, I mean, these changes and shifts that we have discussed now in the Q&A and also to an extent in your talk, that and sort of in our public discourse is often described, sometimes more, sometimes less, with cultural pessimism, and we see ourselves as societies on the verge of a nervous breakdown very often because of the developments that you also just described, the sensationalism, the emotional factor, the role that Facebook and so on plays on our public discourse, and the impact it has on journalists when it comes to how they talk, how they produce, and when it comes to the products that they produce, which they, some more, some less, try to make fit to these logics. And I was wondering, how do you perceive the public and political discussions around these developments in the UK, or also maybe in Europe? How do we discuss media policy and these changes and the changes to journalism in our public spheres, and what could and should be done about it? And I know you're not a fan of sort of deterministic views, but do you see a potential for really for constructive and positive change, apart, you know, from elites still being able to consume the London Review of Books and the New Yorker, and in that sense, I mean, the public sphere, or the media landscape is perhaps better than ever before for people like us, because we actually have access to digital media to the best journalism ever. But that doesn't hold true sort of at a broader level and for society as a whole. Do you see a constructive and a positive potential for the future? I know it's pretty broad questions, but I'd just be curious what you have to say on this.
No.
Okay.
I think there's two parts to that. What one is in the ways that corporations are monopolizing. I think that's the best word. The affordances of these incredibly exciting new media technologies with so many other potentials. And the second part of my no answer is because of the ways in which public policy around communications, public policy around news media, the discussions are so impoverished. It just seems as if the corporations and the political elites, they have closed door discussions, and the sorts of discussions that allow the public in to ask what sort of news media they want is so market driven, is so commercialized as to leave that vital civic element to one side. So I suppose one of the great tragedies of the era we're living through is in the dearth of reporting on vital local issues at a local governmental level, because local newspapers just simply cannot afford to have somebody sitting in council meetings listening to the discussions which determine the shapes of millions of people's daily lives. So I think I see a bleak prognosis unless the public are allowed back in or demand a place back in the discussions about communication policies in the future.